Okay, Rohan, it's about to start live streaming. It's just loading.
Hi everyone. So first off, apologies about my current appearance. I've been biking all day, but my name is Laura McGinnis. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm a freshman at Howard University. All right, let's get started. Okay, so this presentation is obviously on safety in schools. And the purpose for this presentation is to educate y'all a little bit about abolition, school resource officers, and reimagining safety in schools, and to help mobilize the community. So we are the Acorn Collective, and just to give you a little summary of who we are a collection of BIPOC youth and white allies. We are organizers and activists, and a little bit about what we do. We uplift BIPOC voices, and we create community accountability, challenge institutions of power. Yeah, so let's get started. Sophia, I'm gonna pass it to you.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Sophia. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm senior at GBN, and I'm going to be talking about abolition. So that's really the basis of this presentation. The first thing that I want to do is define a couple of things. So I'm defining abolition as dismantling institutions that are built to brutalize, and murder Black and brown people and decolonizing your entire worldview. Um, to be more specific, I'm defining police abolition as the end of police and reimagining public safety, and prison abolition as the end of prisons and reimagining punishment with restorative justice and transformative justice. Um, the next definition is the carceral state, which is police, prisons, and the military. Police and prison abolition often are different, but they often overlap, and I'll go more in depth on that later. And if we're abolishing the policing, we're actively seeking the end of the carceral state, effectively stopping the US's domestic and international power. Reform, on the other hand, would be amending existing systems and institutions. So examples of police reform include banning chokeholds and strangleholds, making body cams mandatory, and banning shooting at moving vehicles. The next term I'm going to be using is restorative justice, which is alternative justice that doesn't involve the state's criminal justice system. And I'm also going to be talking about systemic racism, which is the ways that institutions oppress Black, Indigenous people of color. The prison industrial complex is a really important concept, and we use that term to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. Finally, the last thing I'm going to talk about is mutual aid. And mutual aid is when people work in different ways as a community to alter their political condition. So, moving on. How does abolition occur? I'm using this from 8 to Abolition, and they lay out 8 different things that can lead to abolition. So right now I'm focusing on defunding police and freeing people from prisons and jails. And the next thing I'm going to talk about is defunding police and what that looks like. What does it look like? Well, to start, it looks like rejecting any proposed expansion to police budgets, demanding the highest budget cuts per year until the police budget reaches zero. This includes slashing police salaries across the board until they're zeroed out, immediately firing police officers who have any excessive force complaints, no hiring of new officers or replacement of fired or resigned officers, fully cutting funding for public relations, and suspending the paid administrative leave for cops under investigation. It also means requiring police, not cities, to be liable for misconduct and violent settlements, and banning police contracting for nonprofits and institutions. Lastly, it means deplatforming white supremacist public officials. The next avenue of abolition I'm going to talk about is freeing people from prisons and jails. This includes permanently closing jails, rejecting alternatives to incarceration that are carceral in nature, including problem-solving courts and electronic monitoring and coercive restorative justice programs, reducing jail churn by reducing arrests, freeing all people from involuntary confinement, including but not limited to jails, prisons, immigrant detention centers, psychiatric wards, and nursing homes, starting with vulnerable populations such as those who are aging, disabled, immunocompromised, held on bail, or held for parole violations, and survivors. It also includes cutting funding to prosecutor offices, ending pretrial detention, ending civil commitment, releasing all people held pretrial and on parole violations, making all communication to and from prisoners free, and ending immigration detention and family separation. Now I'm going to talk about a little bit of the history behind abolition. Original abolitionists fought to abolish slavery in the 19th century, and this includes revolutionary leaders like John Brown, Frederick Douglass, and Sojourner Truth. Police actually originated as slave patrols meant to catch enslaved people who ran away. Meanwhile, police in the North were used to control immigrants and their housing. All over the country, pre and post Civil War, police were assigned to protect land owned by upper class white men. After the Civil War, the 13th Amendment states that slavery was abolished, except as punishment for a crime. So then you get black codes passed by many states, and black codes restricted the freedom that black people had and made it extremely easy for black people to go to jail. Black codes set a precedent for Jim Crow laws, which police officers would go on to enforce. The Mississippi black codes included an amendment to vagrant laws, which made it illegal for Black people over the age of 18 to be unemployed and made it illegal for Black people to remain unsettled. I'll expand more on the effects of the 13th Amendment today in a bit, but right now I'm going to fast forward to the 60s. So during the civil rights movement, the Black Panther released the 10-point program, which was the foundation for the demands of the current revolution. The Black Panther Party was a Marxist Black nationalist group the US government unjustly labeled and treated as domestic terrorists. Mutual aid was a crucial part of the Black Panthers. So in Oakland, there was something called the Panther Free Food Program. Fred Hampton actually led 5 different breakfast programs on Chicago's West Side, as well as creating a free medical center. The Panthers would also transport people to hospitals if they needed it. So they did a lot of stuff with mutual aid. On December 4th, 1969, the FBI broke into Hampton's apartment and killed him while he was sleeping. Hampton was not the only Panther targeted by the FBI either. So right now I just want to take a look at the Panthers 10-point program, and we can see everything that they laid out. Lastly, I'm going to be talking about the prison industrial complex today and how the US has the highest prison population in the world, and per capita, about 2.3 million people are incarcerated today, and Black and brown people are locked up at a disproportionate rate. According to the Pew Research Center, as of 2017, Black people make up about 33% of the US prison population, while only making up 14% of the population. Black people are also incarcerated at a rate 5 times higher than white people. And over the past few decades, the amount of people in prison has skyrocketed. Incarcerated people have done work for all kinds of companies, making cents a day, and those are the prisoners who get paid. This labor includes packing coffee for Starbucks or frozen food for McDonald's, and even fighting fires in California. Not only are the prisoners forced to work, but the conditions inside prisons are inhumane. Some incarcerated people don't have access to basic necessities and are overcrowded in unsanitary conditions. People who are incarcerated have a much higher chance of dying from COVID because they aren't cared for properly. When Caleb Browder was 16, he was arrested for allegedly stealing a backpack. 2 out of the 3 years he was in jail, he was held in solitary confinement. When he got out, he killed himself. And yet solitary confinement is still used today. Incarceration is just so violent, and it completely brutalizes Black and brown people, and police, as agents of the state, assist in expanding the prison industrial complex. Abolition seeks to get rid of the institutions that cause so much harm to Black and brown people, and abolishing the carceral state means reimagining the way we see justice, and most importantly, putting an end to a system that was designed to kill Black people.
Okay, before I start, my name's Fiona. I'm a sophomore at GBN and I use she, her pronouns. So in the conversation surrounding SROs, one of the most important things we have to consider is how students themselves feel in the presence of having an armed officer in their schools. So the roles of an SRO would vary across school districts and communities, but they can range from investigating stolen items, controlling traffic, breaking up fistfights, to arresting students for weapon or drug possession. However, for the majority of the time, students of color are arrested for minor offenses, which is what they call peace disturbance or failure to comply with instructions. And it's really important that we acknowledge the collateral impact on the student following this type of punishment. So after being arrested, students can lose instructional time and course credits. They can lose their jobs. They can be forced to pay heavy court fines and face psychological trauma, especially in instances that may result in violence. And each of these consequences contributes to systemic disparities in Black and Brown communities, whether it's in wealth, education, or mental health. There's overwhelming data to show that SROs do disproportionately target Black and Brown students. And all of the statistics on this slide are from the Advancement Project's Call to Action for Police-Free Schools. And as they display, police officers are often found to misperceive Black and Brown youth as less childlike, less innocent, and less in need of protection than their white peers, which results in a disproportionate number of in-school arrests and lack of mental health resources. And not only does police presence harm Black and Brown students, but it also has a disproportionate impact on LGBTQIA or gender nonconforming students, immigrants, and students with disabilities. So LGBTQIA students have been targeted by officers for expressions of their gender identity, and they often face victim blaming when they do report incidences of assault or harassment. And school is already not a friendly place for LGBTQIA students, but reports have shown that police only exacerbate those issues. Immigrant students are also at a greater risk of detention or deportation procedures. It's really significant that we realize that ICE also operates as a branch of policing, and detainment by school officers is really dangerous for these students and their families who are already at this constant risk of deportation or being arrested. And police are often more likely to use force during encounters with special needs students, especially since they can't be aware of each student's disability and they receive no training on special education. So overall, it's important to realize that SROs don't stand to protect these groups. And I'm going to pass it to Lauren to talk about some of her personal experiences with the SROs at GBN.
Okay, hi, it's me again. So I'm aware that some of you know the story, but for those of you who don't know it, I'm just gonna tell it very quickly. So at GBN, we have a forensics course, which obviously kind of has to do a little bit with policing. And so we had the school resource officer come in for a Q&A session. It started off pretty normally. For a little bit of backstory, me and the school resource officer already did not really get along. He knew that I was involved in the Black Student Union. One of my friends had brought it up to him once, and he kind of gave me a weird look. So what followed, but like I had a bad gut feeling, you know, with my previous experience with police and being Black in this country. I had a bad feeling about this Q&A, but I was not prepared for what was about to happen. So everything started off pretty normally, and I don't exactly remember how it happened, but he got on a little bit of a tangent about the liberal elitist media. And so he started talking about police brutality, and he used the Trayvon Martin case as an example. So for those of you who don't know, Trayvon Martin was a 17-year-old Black boy who committed no crime except walking in a gated community late at night. And for the record, the man who shot him was not even an officer. But basically, the school resource officer looked directly at me and said, "I think that the Trayvon Martin case was handled correctly. It was handled perfectly, and the officer did nothing wrong." Now, the implications this has on a Black girl in the classroom, and at the time I was 17, Trayvon Martin's age, to know that there is a police officer in the school with a gun who saw nothing wrong in that case, it is traumatizing. And to know that to be clear, like I'm well aware that I'm a light-skinned woman, and I mean, that severely decreases the chance of me being shot and killed. But I do have a brother, and for those of you who know him, he's a really sweet kid, but he has a bit of a temper, making him like a walking liability. All it would take is one mistake, and he would be shot and killed. So to know that, to have that thought in the back of your head every time you see this man, to know that he has a gun, is traumatizing. And it makes you wonder if the little bit of false security that white students experience is worth the fact that you are traumatizing Black students and making them fear for their lives in the classroom. All right, I'm done.
Okay, as Lauren was talking about, that's just one example of how the presence of SROs can contribute to disparities, especially in mental health at GBN between Black and Brown students and white students. So I wanted to move on to the issue of school shootings. So this is an issue that often emerges in these types of conversations, and it's basically how will we deal with things like school shootings or instances of violence without an SRO in the building? So first, it's necessary that we realize policing was not created to protect Black and Brown students in the first place, as Sophia was talking about. So before anything else, we have to reflect on the fact that police in schools or out of schools might not have the ability or the desire to protect all students. There's also no piece of conclusive evidence that points to a causal relationship between having an SRO and preventing school shootings, and there's actually very little research on this subject. Much of it is due to the fact that school shootings are so rare. Criminologists from the Washington Post point out that since the 1990s, there have been 22 school shootings in which 2 or more people were shot, which means that's well less than 1 incident per year. And there's less than 1 incident per year of 100,000 public schools and 33,000 private schools, which means that an average of elementary, middle, or high schools can expect to see a mass shooting about once every 150,000 years. Obviously, none of this is to say that school shootings are not a threat. We do believe that they pose a threat to students and that immediate action has to be taken in order to prevent them. However, police are not the solution. Aside from the fact that policing wasn't created to protect Black and Brown students, police are oftentimes not trained to handle weapons around students in the first place, especially young children. There have been over 60 documented times where police have allowed students to get their hands on weapons, such as leaving guns in bathrooms, leaving them within the reach of small children, or accidentally misfiring their weapon. Especially around young kids, this would pose an even greater threat. And also, the average high school is over 170,000 square feet, making it super improbable for one SRO to get to the spot of a shooting without having any casualties happening first, especially when they only have a handgun to match a military-grade weapon. Given all of this, SROs do cause more harm than good, and it's important that we remember the psychological and physical impact that police presence has on BIPOC happens every day, and those impacts aren't just isolated instances. In regards to school safety, there are also other alternatives. Potential alternatives to policing in schools should center around specially trained officials. So one area of this is sexual harassment and assault. So in our district specifically, students have gone to SROs to report harassment or rape, and SROs have consistently failed to provide them with adequate support. And in multiple times, this has been because SROs have a special relationship with the perpetrator or just because they refuse to believe the victim. An alternative to this would be to install specially trained counselors who are equipped with dealing with issues of sexual harassment, and also to install reporting mechanisms for students. Another consistent issue that students face is mental health, and that issue is exacerbated when students have police in schools and no mental health resources. And in the instance of school shootings, more often than not, the shooter is a current or former student of the school who has underlying mental health needs. And harsh disciplinary measures in schools would create a distrusting environment where students do not feel comfortable reporting to an adult if they themselves or a fellow classmate is at risk of harming themselves or others. So instead, investing in a mental health resource would establish a trusting relationship between school officials and students, which makes it likelier that administrators can intervene before a violent incident even takes place. Additionally, divesting from the police would include hiring BIPOC teachers and counselors in order to establish a trusting environment where students do feel comfortable asking for help, as well as investing in inclusive curriculum that teaches students how to deal with these issues. And I'm going to pass it to Yasmin to talk about discussion questions.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. We really appreciate your participation in this. And I want to give a huge thank you to Lauren and Sophia and Fiona for making this presentation and doing such an awesome job presenting. I apologize so much for the slides. I'm a grandma in Zoom, and I'm one of the oldest people in this group right now. So I just wanted to say I'm really proud of our initiative and all the youth in our group for taking ownership of this project. So we'll be putting people into breakout rooms. And right now I'm going to drop the 3 questions that are here in the chat so you can refer to them. So once we're in these breakout rooms, we can go through these questions, but we want the conversation to be organic. So if there's ever a follow-up question that you have or a tangent that you want to go on that's like somewhat related to abolition or SROs, or if you have a question, there will be someone from the Acorn Collective, maybe 2 people who are in your breakout room. So feel free to ask those questions or bring in like personal experiences if you feel comfortable, but there's no pressure. Say anything that is within your comfort zone. And after about like 15, 20 minutes, we'll check in, come back to the main room and do a panel Q&A because we have multiple people from the collective on this call. So I will send you into breakout rooms now, and thank you again for joining us. I think everyone is back. Maybe one more room has come back. But I hope you had good discussions. Even if things lulled, that's okay. I think it's a hard conversation to have, and this is a big topic to chew on. So definitely after this, if you have time, reflect on maybe what Sophia, Lauren, and Fiona have talked about. And in the email where we sent out the Zoom link, we also sent 2 resources. I want to thank Rebecca Panich on the call, who sent me one of them. It's the longer book. It's absolutely fantastic. We pulled a lot of our statistics from there. It's a long read, but I definitely think it's worth going through. And they break it down very well by chapter too. So if you're interested in a certain subject. So I'm going to move on to the last slide, which is just action items. So these are just small things you can do to push the board to vote out SROs or even consider voting out SROs. So the problem is that between the administrators and the school board, they're assigned very different tasks. So though the Acorn Collective is in communication with the principals who are coming on behalf of the superintendent and assistant superintendents, we are not in contact with the school board. And that's because the school board is able to hide behind a veil. The school board is kind of seen as like an accountability measure for schools, but there's no accountability check on the school board, ironically. So their power goes unchecked and also just like not really questioned at all, which is troublesome because they often release policy without making it public, or they like fail to address policy and also to make that public. There's not a lot of transparency with our board compared to other school boards, especially in Chicago with these recent conversations. So you might hear on school board meetings voicemails from members of our collective and supporters asking for them to bring certain things to their agendas. If we keep having those voicemails, they'll eventually have to put it on the agenda. They just need to see public support. And I think that's partly because they're elected officials. They are scared that the public will not vote them back into their position of power. And threatening their power can threaten someone like internally too, especially if you're from a demographic that like is used to being entitled to this kind of power. So we recommend like bringing this conversation home, leaving voicemails. And if you need help leaving voicemails, let us know. We sometimes have templates, and then we can also write a voicemail for you if that's helpful. Emailing the Board of Education as well. I have been in their inbox many times and they're very familiar with my email. And then if you're an ally, try to uplift voices of your BIPOC peers, validate their experiences. I think especially during the time where we released the petition, there was a lot of backlash, but it was from a group of dissenting voices that wasn't particularly big. They were just quite loud. So I think what would support people the most is to have that same equivalent, but on the other side, and maybe even more so, just like uplifting those voices, like telling those stories, maybe not using names, but like validating experiences, telling someone that like they're allowed to feel this way, and also they're like perceiving the situation correctly. They're not misunderstanding an interaction between like themselves and like a person in power. So if you're interested in joining the collective, you're welcome to email us at this email. And if you're interested in getting more updates from us, you can sign up for our listserv and we can send out a follow-up email for that. But thank you for coming. So this next part is just going to be an open Q&A panel. Anyone from the collective can answer these questions. And the way that we have it set up right now is that in the chat, you can either DM me or the questions person. If you could DM the person named questions, that would be preferable. And I think it's under Rohan's name now, or my name. So feel free to send us questions and we can answer them. But if you have to head out as well, we appreciate you being here. It's okay if there are no questions as well. I can, oh, here's a question. Okay. Is there a place online to access call scripts for voicemails to the board meetings? I can take that one. So right now, we don't have one. We have a compilation of our past scripts. So we were thinking of compiling them and then making a general script for certain topics. So like an equity audit script and then an SRO script. You're welcome to combine them. So we will have that done, I think, by the end of this next week and send it out so that by the next board meeting, you'll be able to leave a message if you're interested. But thank you for asking. That's a great suggestion. I'm going to ask my group a question. Why can't we just give SROs more training? I know that they go through police training and they go through maybe some extra training to deal with students. But what if they just did like some social work courses or some counseling courses? Would that be a better solution?
So basically the answer is no, because policing exists. Policing is inherently racist, and because the origins of policing were meant to catch slaves who were Black people, no amount of training can remove that bias. And so police as they exist today protect two things. They protect the wealthy and they protect property. And so no amount of reform to policing will allow police to protect and serve.
Okay, yes to everything that Sophia said. Also, if they're getting more training, they're getting more money. And I've tried looking into the Northbrook Police Department's budget, and like I think as a collective, we've tried, and they're just not transparent about anything. So we don't ultimately, if they are getting more money, there's no way to hold them accountable for where this money is going and what they're using it for.
Yeah, those are fantastic answers and the right answers. I think that we get that question quite a lot. And then I think the second most common question we get is, could we replace SROs with like bodyguards instead, like people who have not gone through police training, but have some sort of security background, and they could protect the school. They'll be like very experienced with whatever weapon they have. And then they can also do some additional training to like be culturally competent and competent with students. Does that work?
Okay, I can answer that. I think our answer to that would be like they're ultimately the same thing, especially if you have a background in security. I think they're ultimately going to be very similar. And the fact that they're not specialized still in dealing with sexual assault, in dealing with race, and dealing with LGBTQIA students, I think that ultimately devolves into being the same thing as having a police officer in the building. And even if it's under a different label, but if it's functionally the same thing, then it's still going to have a disproportionate impact, especially within our district, just psychologically on the very few Black students that we have. Yeah, basically the alternatives that we list would be, because I know like our district does have the money, so the alternatives would be specially trained to do certain things that aren't involving force and aren't necessarily in the background of security.
And I think one more thing that comes with exactly what Fiona's saying, and like I totally agree, is that having a bodyguard and police suggests that that's the form of punishment that students will be receiving, and we have to like rethink punishment. I think schools need to like completely re-examine why we even use punishment the way that we do, and like how can we make that justice instead, like either restorative and preferably like transformative justice for both the person who went through the traumatic experience and the person who was um, the abuser. We got another question that is, what are some reforms the Acorn Collective opposes in the area of SROs or otherwise?
Okay, I can answer this again. Reforms that we oppose would be basically anything that gives the police more money, because like we were talking about, they're not transparent with that at all, and we really don't know where that's going. So I would say that reform can be used as an avenue towards abolition. Like I know Sophia was talking about this, like proposals to defund, but I think a lot of them ultimately end up giving more power to the police.
I echo that as well, and I urge everyone to check out the resource aidtoabolition.com. The abolitionists there are absolutely fantastic, put in a lot of work, and Sophia had cited in her slides, and they also give really good reasons as to why we should oppose reforms. They made a great chart as to which reforms give police more money, and ultimately I think that though it sounds dramatic, getting rid of an SRO is the only way to really like reconcile what's been happening with Black and brown students like in and out of school. I think now is not the time to consider reform because that's been happening for years, and none of it has worked, and for a reason, and that's because the root of this policing is like inherently racist and it will never change. I've heard this many times from abolitionists that are like, police are not a broken system, they're operating exactly how they're meant to. So we can't say that we can fix them because they're doing what they've been doing since forever, right? So the only way to really address that is to abolish them. Okay, this might be the last question. So what are alternatives to police? And thank you so much for the questions.
Okay, I guess I could take this one. So instead of police, you need to create like a culture in the community that's not inherently militaristic or racist. So ways you could do that are mental health resources. Obviously, you would have some kind of resource for, if something gets like stolen or lost, but that would not be the police. Instead, you would have like a some kind of like community resource, and then like other things that the police would handle, like mental health problems and things like that, can actually be like reallocated to different resources that can better handle those issues.
Thank you so much, Jack. Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think community accountability boards are a great option. There are a bunch of people in communities who want to take ownership of this kind of work and be there to support everyone. You can think of your community as a co-op where you really do create like roles for people, and this won't feel like work. This will feel like a way to like build relationships and maintain them and to check in on people. And I think it'll be a much less exhausting measure than having to constantly deal with police. And I'm going to drop a link in the chat, and this goes to a file that talks about like what's next, and it has a lot of alternatives to police that are listed in there. And I highly recommend reading it if you have the time, and I can also send this out in an email as well. I think that's it. Thank you so much for coming. We will definitely be having another teach out, maybe on abolition as a whole, and other concepts around like co-opting movements or the movement itself. But again, I want to thank all the presenters and thank you to all of my collective members for coming and supporting this, and all of the guests for participating in the discussions and being willing to have this conversation. We know it can be uncomfortable, like I said before, but it's about time that it's come to Northbrook and Glenview. So we're happy that the work is happening here. And you can email us with any questions that you have. But thank you so much for joining, and we hope to see you soon.